In today's episode, we discuss the Roman general Sulla, the ancient Greeks, the importance of character, passion, the modern world, and much more. I really hope you'll enjoy today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. Today's show is brought to you by Icepod, finally an affordable, portable, and effective way to get the benefits of cold water immersion in the comfort of your own home. I opted for the Pro Bundle, which includes the Icepod, a water circulating pump, a special insulated lid, and a thermometer to check the temp of your water. Even in Georgia, the Icepod keeps my water between 60 and 70 degrees, and when I load it up with the 36-pack of water bottles that I use and refreeze after each session, I can easily get it around 50 degrees for the perfect cold water immersion experience. Despite being light and portable, the Icepod is super durable, and it's the perfect solution for anyone who wants to experience the benefits of cold water immersion without spending thousands of dollars for a home water chiller or trying to DIY your own. Cold immersion can help with recovery and muscle soreness, raise dopamine levels, help you wake up and be more alert, help you to burn more calories, mobilize brown fat, and more. Visit podcompany.com and use my special promo code SHANE50107 for $10 off your order, and each sale helps to support the show as well. Stay cool out there, people. Are you looking for the perfect high-protein snack that isn't loaded with stuff like MSG, nitrates, and sugar? Carnivore Snacks is the perfect high-protein snack made from quality grass-fed beef and salt. That's it. Each bag uses 1 pound of high-quality beef, lamb, pork, or chicken, salt, and nothing else. Aside from being easy, healthy, and convenient, they also taste great. These snacks are not just another jerky. They are way better. Give a bag a try, and I know you'll keep coming back. Check out Carnivore Snacks, spelled with an X.com, and enter coupon code SHANE05137 for 15% off your order, and each sale will help support the Renaissance Wisdom podcast as well. Welcome to the Renaissance Wisdom podcast, where ancient and modern wisdom come together to create a better way of living. I'm your host, Shane Sorensen, and each week we speak with successful people from a plethora of disciplines in search of wisdom from their own lives. Your own personal Renaissance begins today. Let wisdom be your guide. Hey everybody, welcome to the Renaissance Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Shane Sorensen. I'm here with today's guest, Alex Petkas. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm excited to have the introduce you to the listeners a little bit. So why don't you start out just by telling us about you and your background a little bit?
Yeah, I'm a former academic. I left academia around 2020. I was in a tenure track job, and I got out of there for basically I felt like so I was a classicist. I studied ancient Greek and the Romans and the Greeks, both the history and the literature, and I got into it really thinking that the ancient texts and ancient philosophies can and should have an impact on our lives, and I just decided that in academia that maybe that wasn't the best way to present it to people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of my motivations for leaving, and now I left to kind of pursue entrepreneurship, and so that's going pretty well. And now I'm working on a couple of projects maybe we can talk about as the show goes on. But my background is basically ancient Greek nerd turned entrepreneur, trying to figure it out as I go.
Awesome. That's a great background, because I think probably a lot of the listeners and also myself, I guess I kind of have like the opposite the opposite experience, where you're doing life and then you kind of realize, like, I don't know, it seems like there's something lacking a little bit, and then you get into philosophy, searching for answers. So I mean, I guess quick side question. I mean, do you feel like being introduced to philosophy as a career sort of changes your view of it, or do you think that I guess it can, right? I think you are muted at the.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, so I see this a lot these days. I think that the time and history that we're in might be part of it, or just maybe it's a phase of life where people, when they get a little further into their careers or get around the time where they're getting married, having kids, they start to ask deeper questions or want more of a structure. And I think coming at it when I did it, academia really kind of warps your perspective on what philosophy is potentially,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be a kind of intellectual exercise, which there was a little bit of that in antiquity, but for the most part, philosophy in the ancient world and the Renaissance world for most of history has been a practical discipline for people that
Yeah.
weren't professional philosophers and were looking for wisdom and guidance on how to live their lives and how to like become who they were supposed to be and fulfill their potential. And so I think that to the extent that philosophy can get back to that essential promise and that essential like attention to real life, then it's more likely to have an impact. And that was another frustration I had, and another reason I left academia. Not that you can't do that in academia, because there are good people doing that, but there's a lot working against you. You're swimming upstream.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as far as like what you're working on now, like tell me a little bit about what you're doing now and what you're working on currently.
So I have a day job where I'm doing some marketing and finance, but I split my time between that and then my project that entrepreneurial project I'm trying to build is The Cost of Glory, which is
Mm-hmm.
mainly a podcast right now. I've been working on it for about 2 years. Excuse me. And it is my project is basically the content I put out is all about connecting with the lives of great ancient leaders through biography, through long form biography, long form for audio. My biographies that I do are way shorter than most biographies that you would buy or listen to on, say, Audible. But I'm taking my inspiration from an ancient philosopher who happened to write the greatest biography collection in antiquity, maybe ever in history. It's certainly the most influential, and that was Plutarch, who is the author of the Parallel Lives, and he wrote this collection of maybe 50 surviving biographies of great ancient leaders. All of them were statesmen, and many of them were generals. Most of them were generals and politicians. So they were men of action. Plutarch himself was a sort of minor local politician, but he was also a very serious writer and philosopher. And he was interested in collecting these biographies that are pretty bite-sized compared to what we're used to with these doorstop, phone books, 1,000-page exhaustive biographies now. They're more like 50, 60 pages and 30 at the lower limit, and just trying to collect as much insight and wisdom as you can from looking at the career of a great leader, and also finding Plutarch has this great eye for dramatic scenes and like key moments of history, and so I try to bring that into my podcast as well. And around that, I'm building a business slowly for leadership training, education, and the art of public speaking, which is kind of the primary career skill in antiquity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I saw a lot of that in my study, when I was writing my book for like the Renaissance as well, that the people that inspired the Renaissance, like the men that the Renaissance humanists looked up to, were a lot of the same men that you're probably referencing to, like your Cicero, your Quintilian. They looked up to Seneca a lot. I think Plutarch was read during the period as well, but there's something about a time period where a bunch of people collectively start looking back at people who inspired them from the generations before. And there seems to be a lot of really powerful lessons, especially as you were speaking about like some of the practicality of public speaking, when you go back and you read Quintilian or you read Cicero, their teachings are very powerful in those respects. So, like when you're profiling, when you're doing these, mini biographies, so to speak, or bite-sized biographies, what is it that you personally think is so powerful about those, and why do you feel like this kind of compelling inner drive to share them with other people? What do you think people can take out of history and out of these biographies?
Well, one of the things that I've sensed is that we're living in times of chaos and tumult. At least that's the vibe. A lot of people have this feeling.
Yeah.
And Plutarch has been an author, and like the lives of great leaders of the past have been a subject that people have turned to often in those kinds of times. So the Renaissance, like you mentioned, Plutarch was translated kind of early into Italian and Latin in the Renaissance, and he was a very popular author for the biography of Cicero, biography of Julius Caesar, Brutus, the guy who murdered him, his friend who murdered him, Alexander the Great, great leaders of Athens, and in the Renaissance in particular, they're looking at these ancient figures and seeing a lot of similar political configurations where you've got warring city-states in ancient Greece and you've got warring city-states in Renaissance Italy, and so, but also the U.S. founding fathers, another kind of time of chaos and tumult and infinite potential. Plutarch was one of the top 5 most popular books in the American colonies. It was like if you had a bookshelf with 10 books on it, chances are a collection of Plutarch's biographies was going to be on there. And the founding fathers were very interested in many of the figures. The life of Cato the Younger was extremely popular. He's a Stoic figure from around the time of Julius Caesar. Really, Julius Caesar's great nemesis in politics was Cato, and he was trying to keep the republic from falling apart and falling into a monarchy or a tyranny, as he would have called it. So I think that when we're looking for when we're facing times of chaos, probably especially as men, but anybody, you are really, you feel this pressure to be your best self and to figure out what it's going to take to be that person, and what kind of I don't know, to make good decisions when there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons that people turn to biographies in these kinds of times. And there are just countless lessons for how to face risk and uncertainty, and how to bring out your full character, build your career in these biographies, and they're just inspiring. And there's this emotion that the Greeks were really interested in that we don't have a great word for. They called it zeal, or zelos, which is where we get the word zeal. It doesn't mean what we say when we say zeal. It's is the emotion that you feel when you see something great in somebody else and you want to achieve it. I've heard Rob Henderson call it good envy, or like positive envy. So you might call it emulation. That's not a word that we use a lot these days, emulation, but it's the feeling of wanting to be, of like a positive kind of jealousy, you might call it. But they thought of it as a good emotion, and quite distinct from envy. And that was the driver of greatness in the eyes of a Greek philosopher like Plutarch. He talks about zeal all the time when he's writing his biographies. And that's the purpose. If there's concrete lessons you can learn, but there's also this like energy that you can get, this drive that you can get from just hearing stories of people doing amazing things, that kind of powers you through your day, through your year. So that's what inspires me to keep going and share these stories with people, and see what comes of it.
Yeah, that's really well said, and I like that you emphasize kind of the 2 different areas, which is obviously like the practical lessons that we can take, because so much of wisdom comes through experience, but when you pick up a biography, you can learn from the experiences of someone else. So when you get to learn about how somebody that, almost lost an empire, for example, deals with failure, you can take powerful lessons out that allow you to deal with your own failures, even though they might be a little bit smaller, in some ways. And
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective. I mean, these guys are getting exiled, they're losing
right.
children. I mean, it's just so much suffering, and I've definitely benefited a lot personally myself from the encouragement of that.
And on the zeal end too, which I've never heard that, the reference to zeal. And you said the Greek word was what for zeal?
Zelos.
Zelos.
Hmm.
Um, I frequently talk about, and I talked about in my book a little bit, like the Greek city states. And
Hmm.
one of the reasons I believe so much in individualism is because of the Greek states. I know that there's a very big emphasis on like your duty to your state, but one of the best ways that they promoted a strong state was through strong individuals. And I know that's why there's so much of an emphasis on, like, for example, the Olympic Games, and we see all these statues of athletes, because when people see greatness, it inspires them. It causes something within them to stir and awaken, that once makes them want to be great as well. And when you have all these different individuals that are doing different things and following their passions and doing what speaks to them, but everyone is striving to be their best in their field, you end up with a very strong state. And that's one of the reasons why I think I'm so against some of like the more modern collectivism that we see, is that it really, when you force uniformity and when you want people to be equal in every single way, obviously equality doesn't really exist outside of like human society too much. In nature, it's kind of about the survival of the fittest. And so I think, finding the balance between those two is something we need to get back to in society in general, for sure.
Yeah, the Greeks were great. They were experimenters, state builders. The Greek city-states were kind of new when at the time that we're looking at them, in the classical period of Plato and Aristotle, and a little bit before that in the days of Greek tragedy and Herodotus. These are really kind of new institutions. They've only been around for a couple of centuries, and they were kind of built through trial and error. And I think somebody like Aristotle, if you read his Politics, I mean, it's clear that these people think intensely about incentive structures, and
Mhm.
because they have 50 other Greek city states to compare themselves to, and they're saying, well, what is it that makes the Spartans so good at winning at wars? What is it that makes um, Athens so internally stable? What is it that makes Syracuse so rich? And they're looking at the incentive structures of their councils um, and their laws. But the Olympic Games is just a great example of how the Greeks really valued zeal, and how they structured their society around it in many ways. There's another important concept that the Greeks talk about a lot in their political discourse, and that is ambition. But the Greek word for ambition, our word for ambition comes from Latin, means walking around, like a politician walks around and shakes hands before an election.
Mhm.
Ambi itio. But in Greek, the word for ambition is philotimia, which is the love of honor. And so
Mm.
for a Greek city state, they want ambitious individuals. They want people who love honor, because the city state, the polis, Athens, Sparta, is the only institution that can give honor, and it is the main currency that the city state trades in. Like the the highest thing that an individual can desire in the Greek mind is honor. And so they want to cultivate people that they can incentivize with honors, like being the general, or being or getting an honor in the arena, a crown of victory at the Olympic Games. Like that's not worth a lot of money, but it's worth a lot of honor, and that's more important. And so um, I think we've sort of gotten away from an honor culture in a lot of ways, and money is often the main motivation that drives people.
Yeah.
Um, but so they thought a lot about incentive structures um, and how to make people go for um, those those prizes of excellence and the qualities of excellence that are just like harder to think about in financial terms. And so I'd like to see us get back to that for sure.
Yeah. We definitely have, it seems collectively, like as a society, we've definitely traded a lot of ideas of just virtue in general for financial gain. And it's driven, like, there's multiple levels of it, I think, in society too. I mean, it's driven through advertisements. It's driven through like a very consumer based society, social media, where it's like your honor, quote unquote, is like posting the Ferrari on your Instagram page, or that's like the modern equivalent, I guess, to being a great general or something. Is like everyone's like, oh, look at that McLaren, look at that Ferrari. I guess would be nice to see a little bit more emphasis on someone's virtue and character as opposed to just physical assets.
I think honor would, like real honor, if people experienced it, it would feel a lot better, actually. Like
Yeah.
it would be a lot more satisfying if, say, you're in a city of 10,000 people, and for one day, everybody in that 10,000 is like looking at you and clapping for you. And then you're going to see them for the rest of your life on a regular basis because you're living in a small city. They're not just kind of 10,000 random people on the internet. I think we crave that, actually, and it's not that easy to find these days, or I think people would be chasing it more.
Yeah, very true. So I know we talked a little bit about, we're gonna take a little bit of a different turn than what the listeners may be used to. I know that part of what you do on your podcast, or the biggest part of what you do, is you profile great people. And so I know you had the idea to profile someone a little bit on this show, and I think it's a great idea. I think that the listeners will be able to pull some lessons out of it. So I know that you wanted to talk about the Roman general Sulla. So why don't you just give me a little bit of I guess like a brief intro for anybody that's not familiar with him.
Yeah, so Sulla is one of the figures that I've recently done on the cost of glory, and I think he's an interesting figure. He's kind of been in the news a little bit lately because Elon Musk has been uh, he's made a few tweets in reference to Sulla, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So the basic idea, that Sulla, in a nutshell, he's living in the generation before Julius Caesar, before the breakdown of, so Rome transitioned from being a collective government, a republic, into being a monarchy, an empire, and Sulla is part of that story of the kind of breakdown. But he's a very talented, aspiring politician, and he gets into a conflict with a rival. The rival's name is Gaius Marius, and they basically, to not go into too many details, they have a falling out over which Roman should lead an army against King Mithridates, this rebel king in Asia. And I think it's kind of, that's like, as a side note, like Romans, they realize the greatest thing you can fight over is who gets the honor of being a general, and of leading a war. That's like the highest honor you can possibly get. So Sulla is awarded the command by the Senate, but then Marius uses some legal chicanery to kind of steal the command from Sulla. And Sulla responds by leading his army, marching on Rome and capturing the city, and driving Marius out. This is just completely unprecedented in Roman politics, to use an army to force your will like that. Sulla goes back east to fight the war after he's settled things at Rome, but then his enemies capture the city back in another like bloody siege. And so Sulla fights a war against this extremely powerful foreign enemy for 3 years with no support, no funding, hostile government back at Rome, but he's just off in the east with his army, which is just amazing. This amazing story of a incredibly talented general. And he wins the war. He doesn't completely eliminate the enemy, but he settles the war enough to come back and fix things at Rome, which is to say, take back the city and he wreaks revenge upon his enemies who killed a lot of his friends in the meantime. And basically, when he comes back to Italy, they fight the first great Roman civil war, which was probably the bloodiest Roman civil war. It's this horrible conflict, 200,000 lives lost or more.
Wow.
But he reestablishes order in Rome, and he was a member of the Conservative Party, and the people, his enemies, were members of the populist faction, and so Sulla is like a kind of representative of tradition and the good order, and the other guys were kind of rabble rousers, demagogues. And Sulla most famously goes on this political purge called the proscriptions, where he has a lot of his enemies executed and their estates confiscated. And so this is one of the things that Elon joked about in his tweets about Sulla. He said, maybe we need a modern day Sulla. And Twitter went crazy and people were just freaking out like, Elon. Anyway, we don't need to get into that, but you can see how these political tensions, Sulla is like an interesting figure for people. But I think, and that's kind of the end of the story. He establishes he reestablishes the Constitution to try to prevent abuses that led to the populists being able to take over, and then he dies shortly thereafter, and he leaves a very complicated legacy on Roman politics. But I think that the Plutarch, his biographer, is very interested in Sulla. He's a very complicated man. Tremendous virtues, tremendous vices. He had an incredible ability to read people and to win their favor. He was extremely popular with his troops. He was very charismatic, but also when he finally reestablished order, and he said that he was bringing justice after this abuses of the Civil War and tyrants taking over the city. He presented himself as a figure of justice, but when he got into power, he kind of took the whole retribution thing arguably to excess, and it caused a lot of damage in Roman politics thereafter. So I think he's a fascinating figure to talk about, because every great man has vices, and you have to deal with that fact. Every great leader has something that we would probably not want to emulate. And this is the difference between somebody like Plutarch writing biographies and somebody writing the life of a saint. Plutarch is not interested in saints' lives. He's interested in great men who do great things and also make great mistakes sometimes, because you probably will too if you don't pay attention.
Right.
And that's, I think, the cool thing about reading a biography of a complex man like Sulla. But we can get into some more details maybe as the conversation goes on.
Yeah, that's definitely something. When I did a little bit of research about him, just so I wouldn't, because I actually wasn't familiar with him at all, despite knowing a decent amount about Roman history. And one of the things that stood out in my research was that there definitely was kind of this like conflicted picture that was painted of him, and it makes me think of a lot of other times in history where it's like the victor kind of writes the history, and so there's this like interesting, I guess, like shift in perspective that happens, right? So if you were a populist politician, Sulla would have been awful, right? He comes in, he purges everyone out. But if you were on Sulla's side, if you were on his way of thinking, you may have been cheering this tyrant, right? This kind of dictator that came in and took powers that weren't really given to him through traditional means. And it's very interesting, right? I think of sometimes about even like the World War II era, where we read about Hitler and how terrible he was. And obviously he committed huge atrocities, but they were like this close to winning World War II. I mean, they were like this close to like world domination. And if Hitler had won, we would be reading history books about our great leader, right? About like how he came in this like little tiny spot in Europe, conquered the entire world, and he liberated everyone of like the Jewish scum. And like it's really interesting, right? How there's like this shift of perspective that can happen depending on which side of the fence that you sit on. So, I mean, in your reading, I guess, like, what do you think of some of the criticism of Sulla, where even though he was kind of like trying to defend the Republic, he was using these like dictatorial means to do so?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, interesting example. Yeah, on Sulla's tombstone, it said, "Here lies Sulla, whom no friend ever surpassed in doing kindness, nor any enemy in doing mischief." Um,
Yeah.
and that was what he wanted written on his tombstone. But yeah, it's I think Sulla is a good example of how when he wins, at the end of the day, like, all of his enemies are just dead or they're in exile, and so he really is in this position where his guys are going to control the narrative for a while, and they do for a while. Like, there's 10 or 20 years where don't say anything bad about Sulla. That's a bad idea. His soldiers are all over Italy. They're living in the properties that were confiscated from executed men. There's a lot of reasons to not say anything bad about Sulla. But once those people all die, then other people can kind of start to tell the story in a different way. And so in the immediate aftermath of his victory, all of the histories and all of the kind of news articles, if you will, were praising Sulla. And then the next generation, everybody kind of admitted that he went too far, and we don't actually want to have anybody do that anymore. And Sulla was and Julius Caesar took a lesson from Sulla, that executing your enemies is no way to found a lasting regime or a lasting kind of constitutional order. And so Julius Caesar was famous for his clemency, for his mercy that he showed to his enemies, maybe even to a fault, actually, because people that he spared ended up murdering him. But so, and kind of the pendulum swings back and forth. But I think the Roman politics is so interesting, and the figures in this period are so interesting because they are really dealing at these times with these great polarizations, and they're all trying to control the narrative, and there's just different stories that you can tell about what's going on. But I think, yeah, one of the lessons is for sure moderation. And one of the reasons that Sulla was not very moderate once he won is I think he was kind of old and tired, and he felt like he had worked his ass off for his whole life, and he just wanted to relax a little bit. And because he was not so vigilant maybe about restraining himself, a lot of the people that were in his entourage took advantage of the situation. They wrote all these extra names on the proscription lists for people to get executed, and because his underlings wanted to somebody's mansion, and so they say, "Hey, Sulla, I think this guy said some bad things, or I think he killed somebody in the Civil War." And Sulla's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll sign it off." And so I think there's a real lesson to be learned there about the dangers of victory there too. So I mean, one of the things that we're seeing today is people just don't know how to be moderate in victory in the political sphere. You got to take everything you can if you win the election, because you might lose it on the next round, and it ends up kind of spiraling out of control. And hopefully we can get things under control whatever country you happen to live in.
For sure. Yeah, I like the idea of moderation, and I think a lot about like Aristotle's golden mean or golden middle. The idea that like a lot of times the virtue that we actually seek is in between two extremes, and it's finding that balance. It makes me think of Machiavelli too, a lot on his, treatise on politics in The Prince. And a reoccurring theme, right, is this kind of line between being loved and being feared, where,
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to exact revenge, you need to do it like brutally, swiftly, and just make it happen. But, at other times you need to, and obviously Machiavelli's a little bit openly manipulative when he'll say like doing things to make the people love you, but that, I mean, unfortunately that is politics, right? It's a manipulation of the public in that sense, where you're trying to keep the majority behind you so that uh it doesn't spiral out of control and you don't get taken out of power. And I definitely see the correlation between today's age in that sense, and like our current political spectrum. Like the polarization has gotten absolutely insane, and it very much is. It's like, all right, red takes office and like we got to go in and just do everything that we can to just take control. And like there is no communication or cooperation between the two sides. And I definitely have seen that, right? It's like if you're on the left side of the political spectrum currently, it's like most people are completely in favor of just like, yeah, I mean, if you ask them like, hey, let's just take all these like Republican people and put them in jail, they'd be like, yeah, they're crooks and criminals anyway, like just get rid of them. And look, I don't know where you fall on the spectrum. Like for me, seeing what's happening to Trump right now, like definitely makes me think
Yeah.
about it. It's like the the system is doing everything that they possibly can to just throw this man in jail. And like maybe he's guilty. I don't know. Like I'm a believer in innocent until proven guilty, right? But so like over and over and over, this guy's getting drugged through court just to get him out of like the running. And likewise on the right, I think a lot of people are just at the point where they're like, yeah, just take all those like commie scum and like throw them into the gulag somewhere. And it's it's really interesting, just to see how divisive I guess politics have become based on, I guess, Rome is an interesting time in that period because you have that pendulum swinging frequently, right? I mean, you have like, and there's this rallying cry a lot of times, especially in that period of Rome, where it's like people are calling for the return to the Republic, but they're using like dictatorial control to try to bring back this Roman Republic. Do you think that there's any lessons specifically from that period or from Sulla's life that we can pull from modern politics?
Gosh. Well, there's an interesting kind of phenomenon where it's polarized in Roman politics, from the populars to the conservatives, and then I don't know. It's slowly the polls start to matter less and less, and it starts to be which politician is calling the shots. And I'm not sure that we'll go in this direction, but there, I think you start to see increasing cynicism on both sides of the spectrum, and maybe we're seeing some of that these days, where it's easy for people to make deals across the aisle, just not to favor their constituency, but to favor their own interests. So I think, well, I my takeaway is we're spinning in an increasingly dangerous cycle, and like we need to build our own friendship networks and make sure that we're resilient for times of chaos, so that we don't have to rely on our own party, our own interests getting in charge, that we're not putting our faith in that. Put not your trust in princes and sons of men, in whom there's no salvation. I mean, so like, how can you put yourself in a position to rebuild if things get dangerous, and also just locally connect with people that are in your community? And I think that that's the best antidote that I've found to kind of internet ideology polarization, the kind of political polarization that we're trying to get drawn into. I'm not saying that there's not a right and a wrong, but at the end of the day, like, get to know the people that are around you. I mean, we have kids in a local school, and it's a private school, and we're like making connections with the parents there. Schools are a great way to get in touch with local people. I mean, I didn't think about talking this, but this is really what I'm doing um, in trying to kind of, I don't know, build the most resilient life you can when you're not sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I think that you can take a lot of like individual lessons from the great leaders of the past on how to rise up in your own organization, how to build a constituency of people, and like win people's trust. Sulla was really good at as a low-ranking officer, you can see these elements that were promises of his greatness, like when he was on campaign in Africa with his general Marius. So he's like a junior officer, and he's actually serving the man that he's eventually going to fight the civil war against. But they're in the same army, and he's a subordinate officer, and he does everything he can to make his general's life easier. He actually becomes Marius's like right-hand man and his most trusted officer, because he just works his ass off, and he wins the favor of all of the junior officer corps, and the soldiers love him because they see him out working in the trenches with them. And so I think like that's something that everybody should be doing, is like trying to build to do favors for people. And so Sallust, one of his the historians that talks about Sulla, says Sulla took steps to ensure that he owed nobody anything, and everybody else owed him as much as possible. So so there's, I mean, it's not just about being servant-hearted if you want to emulate Sulla. It's about building a kind of a network of people that look to you as somebody who can help them. And I think that's a lesson that I've taken a lot from kind of Sulla on how to build friendships locally if you're in a new place, for example, in a new situation. So yeah, there's a lot you could talk about there.
For sure. That brings up one of my questions I wanted to ask you about too, where obviously like there's something inspiring about like great generals or great leaders, right? Because you kind of see how they manage large groups of people, and they act strategically so that their desired outcome comes to pass, right? There's something very powerful about someone that can take 100,000 people and direct them in a way that leads to a victory in a battle. And there's so much in war specifically that is strategic, right? It's kind of like human chess, right? I mean, you're directing where these people are going, and you're trying to reinforce weaknesses. You're trying to enact elements of surprise, and ultimately to get a victory. And I think about the way that we live life, right? And in a lot of ways, that's kind of what wisdom is you're trying to chart your best course of living, right? I mean, you're trying to look at potential outcomes and make the most strategic decision that won't just necessarily lead to easiness, or won't just lead to comfort, but to actually make the decision that's going to lead to the best possible outcome for you. So, I mean, what do you think it is about military leaders, and specifically, I guess, Sulla, that makes them able to get in there and lead and inspire? I mean, do you think it's just specifically, I know you mentioned like his ability to win the favor of people around him and inspire, but do you think there's more to it as well?
Well, one of the main things about being an ancient general, and probably about being a modern general too, I wouldn't really know, 90% of what you're doing, even in an active war, is logistics, and it's planning. It's putting your army in the right position, and so putting yourself in a really strong position so that the enemy doesn't dare attack you, or trying to trick them into attacking you, and they think you're in a weak position, but you're actually in a strong position. So much of it is this kind of chess of thinking several steps ahead, and making sure that you have food, and so I think there's a kind of intensive planning that has to go into a good general's work. But I think that's a hard thing to pick up from a biography. How do I become an intensive planner like that? I think you have to do it to get better at it, and to get experience. But they also, any great general has to inspire his men, has to inspire his troops, and a lot of that is storytelling. So Sulla is, there's this moment where he has to convince his troops. They're in Campania in southern Italy. It's before he's marched against Mithridates, before any of the falling out with Marius. He gets word from his from a legate, like ambassadors from Rome come, and they say, Sulla, you've just been stripped of the command. Marius is going to lead the army to Mithridates. And so Sulla, at this point, it's never been done in Roman history that a Roman army would march on Rome in a hostile manner. And he has to convince his troops to march with him, 20,000 men, to not abandon him if he wants to do what he wants to do. And so how do you do that? And what he does is he makes a speech, and he eventually gets them to suggest the idea to him. And he's like, no, you can't mean that. And they're like, yes, march on Rome, Sulla. So he's a genius at persuasion. And, so how do you get people to seem to them like it's their own idea in the right situation? That's something that you can study, and I think use in a lot of contexts. The general's communication skills, and he would have done that through storytelling. He was a great lover of the theater. Actually, Sulla was in his youth one of the things that he spent a lot of time doing, because he was kind of poor. For an aristocrat, for a nobleman, he's like, his family's fallen on hard times. In his youth, his dad was kind of not that successful in politics, and so he doesn't inherit much, but so he doesn't have enough money to have political ambition, to go for a political career. So what he does is he just hangs out with actors and frequents the theater, and he actually wrote plays, which is kind of amazing. So I think that you see this too in a lot of great future leaders, is they're really attentive to storytelling and writing and the art of words. And Napoleon wrote these bad novels, and Alexander Hamilton wrote all this poetry, and they're not doing it because they want to be poets. Sulla's not doing this necessarily because he wants to be a comic writer for the theater. They're learning the art of how do you get people to laugh, because that's an incredibly important skill in politics. Obviously somebody like Donald Trump knows the value of getting people to laugh when you want them to laugh, getting them to laugh at the right person at the right time, like your enemies. So they're working on their ability to move hearts with words. So you see that. I think that's a fascinating part of Sulla's story that doesn't get told enough, is he hung out with professional storytellers. So I forgot where I was going, what the question was even, but
yeah, no, it's all great.
I get going on these guys.
Yeah. I really like that emphasis too on, I guess, invoking emotion, right? Because that's
the general's art, so much of it is evoking emotion. But go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's you need it for everything. I do sales in my day job, or I do sales training. We talked about, I manage, have a little bit of ownership in some gyms here in Atlanta, and I tell everybody, anybody that I meet that's younger, I'm like, listen, learn, as much as I love philosophy, right? I'm learn sales. Because
Hmm.
if you learn sales, and so much of sales is philosophy, it really is really intertwined, especially like rhetoric. I mean, if you can sell, it's like you can do anything. And sometimes in sales, like, having someone tell you what they need, like your story with Sulla kind of getting his legion to to suggest marching on Rome. Sometimes that's like the best way. Like when you're trying to sell someone personal training, right? The best thing that you can possibly do is make them realize how much they need it, to the point that they're like asking you for it.
Right.
Like, and some of the times the best way to do that is just to ask questions.
Hmm.
When I have somebody come in, you're like, oh, so like what's your plan for working out? I don't know. I'm just gonna come in. I'm like, oh, really? So you're, planning to get this membership, and you're gonna come in like you don't have a plan, you don't know what you're doing. Like the more you start to probe at those things, it's like people suggest for themselves, like, man, maybe do you guys have like someone that would assist us, or like, would show me what to do? Oh yeah, exactly. Like I'm glad you asked, because yeah, we have somebody
Yeah.
for you. Um, and it's, I don't know, like subtle manipulation, right? I guess, but
Yeah.
that's a very, very important thing. I mean, because everything you do, I mean, whether you're at a job interview, whether you're trying to pitch a business, whether you're uh, a teacher, and you're trying to teach kids about something, like you have to understand what invokes emotion from people, and being able to tap into that is what makes you effective in basically everything you
Yeah.
do. I mean, I don't know that it's really possible to be successful at a high level without having that trait, or without developing that trait.
Well, the ancients would certainly think not. And actually, to bring it back to Sulla, so so the first treatise on psychology is that we have in the Western tradition is Aristotle's Rhetoric. Actually, he
Mm.
wrote a book on the soul, but really, when he talks about the human psyche, he has this whole book of his treatise on how to persuade people on public speaking, where he talks about the various emotions, and he talks about zeal in there. He talks about envy and anger, and it's you know he's a philosopher doing practical psychology for the purpose of winning people's hearts and minds. And actually, Sulla, according to Plutarch, is the man responsible for the fact that we have the texts of Aristotle. Funny enough, when he was in
Mm.
Athens, he yeah, Athens was rebellious against Rome, and
Right.
he had to siege and capture the city. And there was he found this library of Aristotle's works in Athens, and they were all worm eaten and they were neglected. And so he confiscated them, and he took them back to Rome, and the books of Aristotle were then put into proper editions and disseminated, because the rhetoric and the physics and the metaphysics and poetics, all that stuff was not really known. These were his lecture notes, and his text had been lost. So it was we kind of owe that knowledge to Sulla, arguably, which I think is really
Interesting.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me think a bit of the Renaissance too, because that was a huge part of the Renaissance, where these Renaissance humanists going out into old monasteries that had these like caches of books, and uh, they go out and they dig through them, and they find these like tattered pages, like you said, worm eaten, and then they're like so upset because there are these treasures that are in these like states of decay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's been a hugely important thing, right? Like imagine if Sola had not preserved them, we would have lost all of these works that are so widely read and appreciated today.
Yeah, it's just an incalculable sort of crisis point for history there. Do these books get saved or not? And think of the
Yeah,
impact they had. It's just incredible.
for sure.
Yeah.
What do you think, like specifically with Sola? I know we've learned a lot about him. We talked a lot about him. I mean, if there was like one major lesson that you had to pick out from his life, that someone could take and like apply to their life, I mean, have we already covered it, or do you think there?
Here's what I would say, and we haven't talked about this at all. One of the really interesting things about Sulla that I find so compelling about him is, oddly enough, he was actually a man of great faith in a way, and he and you could take that cynically, but I think it was genuine. So he had this great belief in the gods and their favor toward him in particular. And so he would, whenever he had the opportunity, a success in a battle or in the political sphere, he would always attribute it to fortune, to the gods, basically, to forces outside of his control. And he used to say that the decisions that he made, kind of on the spur of the moment, without thinking about it too much, maybe we could read on intuition, turned out better than the ones that he stressed and planned over. And and he just believed that he had this great luck. And a lot of times you think, if you praise the gods or luck instead of giving the credit to yourself, then it's not your victory, it's the god's victory. But that's precisely the point. And one of the things that this did for Sulla, besides I think the fact that kind of makes you just like a more positive person who's able to roll with the punches and trust your intuitions better, is it also, if you are successful, Plutarch notes this in another treatise, this really deflects envy. And envy is kind of the opposite of zeal. It's when you see somebody successful, and instead of wanting that success, you want to deprive them of that success. And so this is a way to deflect envy, to say that, thank God I got lucky, I'm so grateful, and it's fortune, it wasn't me. And I think that this was one of the ways that Sulla was able to build a constituency in the Conservative Party, that he was extremely well liked among his friends, and he was very successful, but he also didn't have all of these like invidious challengers in the same way that a lot of politicians do. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he was able to give credit to other people and to the gods. It kind of, it's a habit that you can cultivate in yourself, to give thanks to the higher power, whatever you believe in, and just not think that everything that you get is yours, because it's ultimately not. Even your successes, you have to leave behind you when you go to the grave, right? So I think that's one of the things that I find the most inspiring about Sulla.
Yeah, that's a really powerful lesson, and it makes me think too. I've frequently reflected on that, at least in our modern age, right? It's like people are very quick to claim successes and very quick to blame failures on external events, which is exactly the opposite of what you're saying about Sulla. And it's very damaging, right? Because it's like when things go right and you quote unquote get lucky, people are like, oh, I did so much to get this, I worked hard, and it does inspire. When someone is like pumping themselves up and singing their own praises, people generally don't feel very inspired to celebrate that person, right? Versus the person that kind of has a humility, whether it's feigned humility or genuine humility, it still tends to make people maybe appreciate that person a little bit more. And something that you see a lot, right, is that everybody in our modern age, for the most part, like when they fail or when something bad happens to them, they blame it on everything else. Like it's this person's fault, or it's the economy's fault, or whatever. And it basically, like, you take away your sense of responsibility to change the event or make it any better. I think it's so important to own our failures, right? I mean, it's like, you don't need to own the successes, right? I mean, like a success is just a notch on the belt. It's something that you have, and it doesn't really get taken away. But I think it's a really, really good point, right? That we should emphasize more our failures and take ownership of those, and to sort of just say, hey, I'm glad that this good thing happened. I got lucky. Maybe I put some hard work in and I got lucky and it paid off, right? And then when something doesn't go our way, to say, all right, like, it's important for me to take control and ownership of this.
Yeah, extreme ownership, right, of the
Yeah,
failures.
Jocko, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it lets you, it helps you learn from your mistakes, because you're otherwise not going to, because they weren't your mistakes. So what is there to learn?
For
And
sure.
and yeah, but giving credit to the gods, or to God, to others, to the team that helped you for one thing, for your victories, so important. And yeah, actually, the topic of self praise is such an interesting topic. Plutarch wrote a whole treatise on that, and on the cost of glory. I do take some lessons from that in a couple of recent episodes I did. But yeah, this is the thing that we don't have a great culture of this in today, of like, what do you do with success? How do you make sure that you are able to build upon that, and keep people well disposed towards you when you do win? And that's very hard to do, actually, and it goes against a lot of our inclinations. Like you said, we're inclined to take the credit for victories and fob off the blame for our defeats.
Yeah.
So yeah, do the opposite for sure.
Yeah, definitely a great lesson. So just kind of wrapping up here, I have some questions I like to ask all my guests. The first one is, do you personally, what are your daily habits? Like, what daily habits do you have?
Well, it's hard to have daily habits when you have a 1-year-old that
Yeah.
wakes up erratically. But I get up in the morning, and I as soon as I can, I have a meditation prayer session that I do for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I used to always get up and read an ancient text in Greek. And for a while, I was reading Homer, just partly to practice my language skills, while I was reading Plato. But it kind of became a spiritual discipline. And, I'm trying to do this with the New Testament these days. And so just read something like rich, and maybe take some notes on it. 10 or 15 minutes doesn't take that much. That really kind of orients me toward my day. I try to work out as much as I can, but that's more of a weekly habit. Go to the gym 4 times a week. Okay, another cool habit that I've picked up lately is I like to journal, but often when you journal, you're kind of doing the stoic thing of, what did I do good today? What did I do bad today? Or you're talking about kind of exhortations to yourself. I think I get that. I do that a lot. And I talk about ideas in my journal. But what I've been trying to do lately is a friend of mine, Benjamin Carlson, on Twitter, who suggested you should try to record an experience that you had. Try to like write down something that stood out to you that day. Because when you go back at your journals, I don't know if you've had this experience, you journal, but it's like your exhortations to yourself are kind of for the day. And I don't know, it's not that interesting to go back and look at those. It's not, you often find that you're just struggling with the same stuff 10 years later, 5 years later. But if you remember something that you experienced that day, like something that your wife said to you, or something sad or something happy happened, it's just it just makes it worth coming back to much later. So those are a couple of habits that I have.
Yeah, I've never really gotten into journaling. I mean, I do a lot of prayer, and I try to, through prayer, I try to remind myself of things to kind of be grateful for, things that we generally would take for granted, right? Like the most important things in our lives that are just there, so we don't really think of them. I try to place an emphasis on that, but I've never, like I said, I've never really gotten into journaling too much. I definitely I can see the potential there. Maybe I can start dabbling into it a little bit.
Yeah, I recommend it. I like it. Kind of clarifies my thoughts for sure.
Sure. What about obviously I know you've read quite a bit through your personal interests, and also through your journey through academia as well, and philosophy and classicism. What are your top two book recommendations if you had to pick two out of the multitude?
Yeah. Well, depending on what you want, I one of the books that I recommend a lot. I think everybody should read, every young man especially, but everybody should read Homer's Iliad.
Yeah.
It's harder to get into, I think, for modern people than the Odyssey, but the Iliad is kind of a big lift, so I'm going to cheat and say what I would recommend if you have trouble getting into Homer is start with an older epic that's shorter, and that's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you could read in just a day if you took the time, but it's a lot shorter, and I really recommend the Stephen Mitchell translation for the Epic of Gilgamesh to get you into the kind of heroic world and the kind of ancient mindset, and think about the difference between nature and culture when you're reading it. I love that epic. So that can be my number one. That's how I'm going to cheat. Number two, I think that you should read Plutarch's Lives. Pick up the biography of Alexander. There's a great Penguin edition, Age of Alexander, or you could pick up the biography of Caesar. Fall of Rome, kinds of Plutarch's Lives collections. Usually there's like 48, 50 of them, but Penguin and Oxford, they'll collect a number of lives in a certain period, and so you'll get the biographies of several of these men around this time. But I think those are texts that Napoleon and Hamilton and great kings have read. So if you want to read an ancient text that's been really impactful and that you can really get through in a week or so, they're not that long. Those are some ones I would recommend.
Yeah, those are great recommendations. And I know you mentioned reading through the New Testament. So like I've read the New Testament, multiple times, but I never could get into the Old Testament. I just kind of felt like it was like, what's the point? Like, why even have it here, right? And I saw a clip of Jordan Peterson talking with Bill Maher, actually, and he was discussing like the relevance of the Old Testament. And I'm really, really abbreviating, so like I'm probably not totally staying true to his message, but like his general message was kind of like, look, if you're reading the Old Testament as like this very like rigid historical document, he's like, you're going to be kind of disappointed. But why shouldn't you read the Old Testament sort of the same way you would read like the Iliad?
Yeah.
And it really changed my perspective, where like when I stopped trying to focus on like all of these little details that may or may not be historically accurate, which like a lot of the things that are in there have been proven over time to be historically accurate. But like when you're not trying to like go through it with a fine tooth comb and like pick apart the ethics of like, oh, well, I don't think this is right for today's age and whatever. When you actually just look at it as like this inspiring story and you try to pull lessons from like each individual event, I think that it becomes a lot more powerful. Because just like in Homer and the Iliad and some of these like great ancient texts, it's like part of the reason that they're so powerful is because they don't like depict human beings as being these perfect people. They highlight, both their victories and their downfalls. And when I think that that's a lot of like when the Old Testament, when you read about slavery and things, it's easy to think like, how could you believe in something that promotes slavery? And it's like, I don't think it's really promoting slavery. It's just saying that this is how it was at this time. And it's painting you a picture of how it was, the reality. And, you can't cut out shortcomings. I mean, you can't make any human being perfect. So I think that, again, like focusing on biographies of these like great ancient stories, I think they're really powerful at that, highlighting, the ups and the downs.
Yeah, the Old Testament's a story of a stiff-necked, sinful people, and but it's an amazing story. And one of the best things I did in college was to not do my homework, but to just stay up late reading through the Old Testament, just from Genesis all the way through. And I think if you just read it as a story, and get into the characters. And I mean, you get into like First and Second Samuel, and you'll just be crying. I mean,
Yeah.
it's powerful. I haven't read through all the laws, but just I think if you get through a boring part, read it out loud. Just stand up, walk around, read it out loud. Just get through it. Don't try to, take a profound lesson from it necessarily, but there's some value in just kind of articulating these things. So you've at least heard them once.
For sure.
Yeah.
What about and I'm assuming you probably, I don't know, depending on how you look at the value of the word hero, do you have any like personal heroes or people that you really look up to that you've read about or in life in general?
Yeah, one of mine is the philosopher Plato. Actually, a lot of people really like Socrates, but I studied the biography of the philosopher Plato a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and he's kind of an inspiration for what I'm doing now. I think Plato is really inspiring to me personally as a writer, as somebody who could move people and shape their lives for the better through storytelling. I mean, the Plato's dialogues are many things, but they're definitely stories, and he told stories within them, and
Yeah.
they're about encounters between people. But Plato was also a man of action. I mean, he founded a school, which is very hard to do. He went to Sicily several times and was involved in some kind of very interesting hijinks, statecraft, and his students went on to topple tyrants and found constitutions. I mean, he was a man of the world and not just an idea guy. And if you can read the Plutarch's Life of Dion, Dion, kind of tells the story of Plato as an actor in the political sphere, which is fascinating. So yeah, that's for like an intellectual trying to build a school or a community. I found Plato to be actually really inspiring. So that's the one I would pick.
Awesome.
For now. Yeah.
Yeah. And the last question I always ask my guests, maybe it's a bit of a stumper, maybe it's not. If you could hop into a time machine, go back to a younger version of yourself, I usually presume somewhere in the teenage years, because I feel like that's a time when we're searching. A lot of times we're soul searching. We're trying to form our ideas about the world and ourselves. If you could go back and give yourself like one piece of advice, what might it be?
All right. So if it's one piece of advice, and I probably wouldn't tell myself to invest early, but I would have told myself that probably if I could give myself two. But the one piece of advice I would give, I think, is to read biographies. I didn't know that I would be this interested in them, and I wish I had started earlier reading the lives of great figures and great leaders, because it ends up being a library that you can keep in your head of examples and experience. And whether it's short biographies or long form ones, I just think that that's something that every young man should start doing, when he's in middle school, at least by high school. And if you haven't started yet, start. But that I would have been a lot further along the road to virtue, I think, than I am now if I had started earlier.
Sure. Yeah, and I definitely, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why, like, for example, the meditations is so popular with so many people, right? Because like a biography kind of paints a picture of who someone is, and you get to see their actions, and you get inside of their head a little bit. And obviously, like, meditations is unique because you're literally reading someone's journal, right? Their inner thoughts, and being able to put yourself into the mind of, and this is an idea that has been talked about many times, right? Like, I believe Napoleon Hill references it in Think and Grow Rich, where he has this like council of the people that he looks up to, and he like closes his eyes and goes up, and he's at like the round table with, these six great minds, and you're like, wait, like, Sulla, what would you do? Like Julius Caesar, what would you do? Seneca, what would you do? To be able to tap into that wellspring of knowledge and experience, whether or not we can truly predict what they would do, if we can kind of put ourselves into that form of thinking, that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, and I think you can access founts of wisdom in yourself that you didn't know were there when you start to think of it, of like, what would X do?
Yeah.
Because your brain can use it, our ability to tell and record stories and derive lessons and actionable like advice for ourselves from the experiences and the stories that we've had is really, really powerful. And so much of it, we just leave it untapped. But that's a way to do it, to like, visualize these people that have had an impact on you in various ways. And because there is so much wisdom that you have stored in deep inside of you. And that's one of the ways that you put it there, by hearing stories and kind of studying the lives of great men, but also like calling them up through your imagination and finding ways to actually put that into action. That's the kind of the mastermind circle of Napoleon Hill,
Yeah,
likes to call it. Yeah, that's a great tactic.
for sure. And I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. If any of the listeners would like to look you up or learn more about like the Cost of Glory podcast, how should someone reach out to you, or how can someone find you?
I'm on all podcast platforms. I'm also on YouTube. I'm at Cost of Glory on Twitter. Twitter is a good way to reach out. AncientLifeCoach.com is my website. And I think there's a link to my email address on there. So yeah, have a listen, reach out, study the lives of the great ancients and the great moderns, and hope to see you there.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks for taking the time, Shane. Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Renaissance Wisdom podcast, and hopefully you learned at least one lesson on today's episode. Our mission here is to uncover practical wisdom to create a better way of living for our audience. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us by leaving the show a review on your podcast platform of choice and by giving it a share on social media. This really helps us to grow our audience and to continue to add more episodes. If you are interested in learning more, please check out our website at RenaissanceWisdom.com or check out the book that started it all, Renaissance Wisdom: How to Flourish in the Modern Day, now on Amazon. Thank you again, and may wisdom be your guide.